Once upon a time, in the heart of the UAE, there was a princess who had everything: wealth, power, and a life of unimaginable luxury. She was the daughter of a powerful prince, born into a world where traditions were deeply rooted, and every step of her life was carefully planned. From the outside, her life seemed like a dream, but behind the golden gates of the palace, she felt trapped. She grew up surrounded by elegance, her every wish granted before she even spoke it. Yet, there was one thing she could never have: freedom. Every decision was made for her, from the way she dressed to the people she could meet. But fate had something different planned. One day, during a charity event organized by the royal family, she met someone who would change her life forever. He was not like the men in her world. He wasn't a prince or a businessman from an elite family. He was simple, kind, and full of dreams. He treated her like a person, not just a princess. His words were honest, his laughter genuine, and for the first time, she felt seen. They started talking in stolen moments, their conversations filled with curiosity and excitement. Every meeting felt like an escape from the walls that confined her. As their bond grew, so did the risks. The palace had eyes everywhere. Her father had high expectations, and love outside the royal bloodline was not an option. She knew that if anyone found out, there would be consequences. But love has a way of making people fearless. She had lived her whole life fulfilling duties. For once, she wanted to follow her heart. Their meetings became more frequent, their emotions deeper. She imagined a life outside the palace, where she could walk freely, love openly, and be herself. But dreams and reality are not always the same. One evening, as she sneaked out to meet him, someone saw them. The news reached her father, and within hours, everything changed. She was confronted, questioned, and warned. She was told that love was a distraction, that her duty was to her family and her people. The man she loved was threatened, forced to leave, and she was left with an impossible choice. Should she stay and live the life chosen for her, or should she risk everything for love? The night she made her decision, the world outside was silent, but inside, her heart was racing. No one knew what she was planning. When morning came, the palace was in chaos. She was gone. Some say she escaped with him, leaving behind her title and wealth for a chance at real happiness. Others believe she was found and brought back, her love story ending before it could truly begin. Even today, whispers of her story linger in the air. Did she find her freedom, or was she forced to forget the love that once made her heart race? Only she knows the truth. But one thing is certain: she dared to dream, and in doing so, she became a legend. The world outside the palace was different from anything she had ever known. The moment she stepped beyond those towering walls, a rush of emotions filled her: fear, excitement, and an overwhelming sense of freedom. For the first time, she wasn't a princess. She was just a woman in love, chasing a life of her own choosing. The streets felt alive in a way the palace never did. Every sound, every movement was new, and for the first time, she could breathe without the weight of expectation pressing down on her. She had planned her escape carefully, knowing there would be consequences. She couldn't risk being found too soon. The man she loved was waiting for her at a hidden location, his heart pounding with the same mixture of fear and hope. He knew what she was leaving behind: a life of unimaginable privilege, a name that commanded respect, and a future that was already written. But none of that mattered to her anymore. She had spent her life in a golden cage. Now she wanted to fly. When they finally met, there were no words, just a moment of silence where their eyes spoke everything. They held on to each other, knowing the road ahead would not be easy. They had no grand palace, no security, and no certainty of what tomorrow would bring. All they had was love and the belief that it was enough. Together, they traveled in secrecy, moving from place to place, always looking over their shoulders. The world outside welcomed them with open arms, but the shadows of the past followed them closely. Back in the UAE, the news of her disappearance had shaken the royal family. Whispers spread through the palace halls, and officials worked tirelessly to track her down. The prince, her father, was furious. For him, this wasn't just about his daughter. It was about honor, tradition, and the legacy of their family. A princess could not simply walk away from her destiny. She was meant to be an example, a symbol of strength and loyalty to her people. Her decision was seen as a betrayal, and he was determined to bring her back. As the days turned into weeks, the couple found themselves torn between their love and the reality of their situation. They knew they couldn't keep running forever. Every step they took was a gamble, and the fear of being discovered never left them. There were moments of pure joy, walking freely under the open sky, laughing without restraint, dreaming without limits. But there were also moments of doubt. Had they made a mistake? Could love truly survive against the weight of an entire kingdom? Then came the moment they had feared the most. A knock on the door, unfamiliar faces, and the realization that they had been found. There was no time to think, no time to escape. In an instant, their world was torn apart. She was taken, her screams lost in the chaos. He was left behind, powerless to stop what had been set in motion. As she was escorted back to the palace, her heart shattered. She had tasted freedom, felt the warmth of love, and now she was being forced back into the life she had fought so hard to leave. But something inside her had changed. She was no longer the same obedient princess. She had seen a different life, and she knew that no matter what happened next, she would never be the same. The journey back to the palace felt longer than ever. Every mile they traveled, she felt the weight of her choices pressing down on her. The car was silent, except for the distant hum of the city outside. She stared out of the window, watching the world she had just begun to embrace slip away from her. Her hands trembled, not from fear, but from the deep, aching realization that she might never see him again. The love she had risked everything for was now nothing more than a memory, and the walls of her past were closing in around her once more. When she arrived at the palace, the grand doors opened, revealing the familiar opulence she had once called home. But now it felt different, cold, distant, like a place she no longer belonged to. The moment she stepped inside, her father was waiting. His face was unreadable, a mixture of disappointment, anger, and something else she couldn't quite understand. He didn't raise his voice, didn't lash out. Instead, he simply looked at her as if searching for the daughter he once knew. "You have shamed us," he finally said, his voice heavy with emotion. "Do you even understand what you have done?" She met his gaze, her heart pounding. She had spent her entire life seeking his approval, trying to live up to the expectations placed upon her. But now, she realized something. No matter how much she obeyed, she would never truly be free. "I only did what I thought was right," she said softly. Her words hung in the air, but they did nothing to change what was already set in motion. The days that followed were a blur. She was kept under strict watch, her every move monitored. The world outside continued as if nothing had happened, but inside, she felt like a prisoner. Her father arranged meetings with advisors, trying to decide what to do with her. Some suggested marriage to a nobleman, ensuring her place in the royal family remained intact. Others advised keeping her hidden until the scandal faded. But none of them asked her what she wanted. Each night, she lay awake, thinking of him. Was he safe? Did he know what had happened to her? Did he still believe they had a chance? The thought of him gave her strength, even in the darkest moments. She refused to let go of the love that had set her free, even if she was back in a cage. Then one evening, a letter arrived. It was slipped under her door, the handwriting unmistakable. Her heart raced as she unfolded the small piece of paper. "I will find you, no matter how long it takes." Tears filled her eyes as she pressed the letter to her chest. Love was not so easily erased. And deep down, she knew her story was not over yet. Days turned into weeks, and the palace remained as grand and silent as ever. She was watched closely, but no one could see the war raging inside her. She played the role they expected, obedient, composed, untouched by the whispers that spread through the halls. But inside, She was counting the days, waiting for a sign, hoping that the promise in his letter was real. She knew the risks he would have to take to reach her. The royal family was powerful, their influence stretching far beyond the palace walls. He would be watched, followed, and if he made one wrong move, he would be erased from existence. The thought terrified her, but she also knew him. He wasn't the kind of man who gave up. He had found her once, and he would find her again. Then, one night, something changed. She was sitting in the garden, the only place where she could be alone, at least for a little while. The air was warm, the scent of flowers surrounding her, but her thoughts were elsewhere. Suddenly, a soft rustling in the distance caught her attention. She turned, her heart stopping for just a moment. There, hidden in the shadows, was him. She almost didn't believe it. He looked different. His face marked with exhaustion, his clothes dusty from travel, but his eyes were the same, full of love, full of fire. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of everything they had been through, everything they had lost, hung between them. "You came," she whispered, barely able to find her voice. "I told you I would," he said, stepping closer. "I will always find you." Tears welled up in her eyes, but there was no time for emotion. They didn't have long. He had risked too much just to see her. She knew they couldn't stay there. They needed a plan, a way to leave the palace without being seen. Running away once had been nearly impossible. Doing it again would be even harder. "I can't stay here," she said, gripping his hands. "But I don't know how to leave." He pulled out a small map, something he had been holding on to tightly. "I have a way," he said, "but we have to be careful. This time, they can't find us." For the first time in weeks, she felt hope. It was dangerous, reckless even, but she knew one thing for certain. She would rather risk everything than live a life without love. As the moon shone above them, they whispered their plan. The guards would change shifts in a few hours. A secret passage led from the garden to the outer walls. If they moved quickly and carefully, they had a chance. The moment she had been waiting for was finally here. This time, she wouldn't hesitate. This time, she would not be caught. This time, she was going to be free. The night was heavy with silence, broken only by the distant sound of footsteps echoing through the palace corridors. She held her breath, every second stretching into eternity. This was it, the moment that would decide everything. If they were caught, there would be no second chances. But if they made it out, they would have a life of their own, far from the golden prison that had kept her caged for so long. He took her hand, his grip firm but gentle, grounding her in the reality of what they were about to do. Moving like shadows, they slipped through the garden, careful to avoid the guards patrolling nearby. She knew this palace better than anyone. Every hidden corridor, every blind spot. It was ironic, really. The place that had once been her cage was now giving her an escape route. Reaching the old passageway, she felt her heart pound in her chest. It had been abandoned for years, a forgotten relic of the past. Pushing open the heavy wooden door, they stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, the scent of time and secrecy lingering in the darkness. He lit a small flashlight, the beam cutting through the shadows. The tunnel stretched ahead, narrow and winding, leading them away from the palace and toward the unknown. With each step, the weight on her shoulders began to lift. She wasn't just running away. She was reclaiming her life. For the first time, she was choosing her own path, free from the expectations that had suffocated her since birth. Then, suddenly, voices. She froze, her pulse racing. The guards were close, their muffled conversation sending waves of fear through her. They must have noticed something. Maybe an open door, a misplaced object, a whisper of movement in the night. She turned to him, panic flickering in her eyes. If they were found now, everything would be over. He squeezed her hand reassuringly and pointed toward a small alcove along the tunnel wall. Without hesitation, they pressed themselves into the shadows, barely breathing as the footsteps grew louder. Seconds stretched into eternity. Then, silence. The guards moved on, their voices fading into the distance. She exhaled shakily, realizing only then how tightly she had been gripping his hand. They weren't safe yet, but they had a chance. Moving quickly, they reached the end of the tunnel. A rusted metal gate blocked their path, but he had come prepared. Producing a small tool from his pocket, he worked swiftly, the lock clicking open within moments. Pushing the gate aside, they stepped into the cool night air. Freedom. She looked up at the endless sky, feeling its vastness wrap around her. For the first time, she wasn't a princess. She wasn't a symbol, a duty, or a name bound by tradition. She was just a girl in love, standing at the edge of a new beginning. And she wasn't looking back. The city stretched before them, alive and pulsing with a freedom she had never known. Lights flickered in the distance, the streets buzzing with people who had no idea that, just a few moments ago, a princess had escaped the walls of her palace. For the first time in her life, she was no longer under the watchful eyes of guards, no longer bound by rules she never chose. She was simply herself, standing next to the man she loved, with nothing but the night and endless possibilities ahead. They moved quickly, blending into the city's rhythm. He had planned everything. Passports, a safe house, a way out of the country before anyone could realize she was missing. But she knew they didn't have much time. By morning, the palace would erupt into chaos. Her absence would not go unnoticed, and when they came looking, they would stop at nothing to find her. As they weaved through narrow streets, she took in every detail, savoring the feeling of being just another person in the crowd. No titles, no expectations. Just a girl walking hand in hand with the man she had risked everything for. They reached a small apartment tucked away in a quiet corner of the city. It wasn't grand, nothing like the opulent chambers she had grown up in, but to her it was perfect, safe, real. As he locked the door behind them, she finally allowed herself to breathe. He turned to her, searching her face for any sign of regret. "Are you sure about this?" he asked softly. She didn't hesitate. "I've never been more sure of anything in my life." The weight of the past weeks, the fear, the uncertainty, it all melted away as she realized the truth. She had spent her life being told who she was supposed to be. But now, for the first time, she was writing her own story. And she wasn't alone. The hours passed in hushed whispers and stolen glances, their excitement tinged with the reality of what they had done. Soon, the news would break. The world would know, and the search would begin. But she refused to live in fear. Not anymore. As dawn approached, they made their way to the airport, their tickets in hand, their plans set in motion. With every step, she felt the past slipping further away. But just as they reached the departure gate, an announcement played over the speakers, one that sent a chill down her spine. Her name, her full name, echoing through the terminal, followed by a request to report to security. She turned to him, her heart pounding. It was happening. They had been found. Their eyes met, and in that moment they both knew. The fight wasn't over. Love had given her the strength to escape. Now, it would have to give her the strength to keep going. Because this wasn't just about running away. This was about never looking back. The airport, once just another part of the city, now felt like a battlefield. Every movement, every passing glance, felt like a threat. The announcement of her name had sent a wave of panic through her, but she forced herself to stay calm. Running now would only confirm suspicion. They had come too far to lose everything in one reckless moment. He squeezed her hand, grounding her. "We keep walking," he whispered. "Act normal." She nodded, swallowing the fear rising in her throat. The plan was simple: blend in, board the flight, and leave before anyone could reach them. But the palace wasn't just going to let her go. They had power, connections, people everywhere. She could already feel their presence, hidden in the crowd, watching. As they moved toward the gate, a group of security officers stood ahead, scanning the crowd. Her heart pounded as they checked passengers one by one. Any second now, one of them would recognize her. Her disguise, a simple dress, a scarf covering her hair, felt too thin, too fragile against the weight of who she really was. Then, just as they reached the line, a voice called out, "Miss, excuse me." She froze. A uniformed officer was walking toward them, his expression unreadable. Her breath caught, but before she could respond, a woman beside her stepped forward. "Yes?" the woman said, turning to face the officer. It took a second for her to realize he wasn't talking to her. Someone else had been called, a coincidence that had nearly shattered her composure. She exhaled slowly, gripping his arm as they moved forward. They couldn't afford another close call. The final checkpoint was just ahead. Their passports were scanned, the boarding passes handed over. Every second stretched unbearably long. She half expected alarms to go off, for guards to swarm them, for her father to appear out of nowhere and drag her back. But then, "Enjoy your flight," the attendant said with a polite smile. She stepped forward, her legs shaking, the final barrier behind them. They walked through the jet bridge, the hum of the plane growing louder, each step feeling surreal. When they finally reached their seats, she sank down, gripping his hand as if letting go would break the moment. The plane doors closed. The engines roared to life. The ground beneath them trembled as they began to move. Then, as the plane lifted off, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she was holding. Below them, the city that had once been her entire world grew smaller and smaller until it was nothing but distant lights. She turned to him, her eyes shining with something new, relief, disbelief, and an overwhelming sense of freedom. "We did it," she whispered. He smiled, pressing a kiss to her forehead. "No," he said, "you did it." And as the plane carried them toward a new life, she finally believed it. She was free.